Welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report, a public policy forum that is co-sponsored by the George Washington University, the National Press Club, and the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. I'm Marvin Kalb, a senior fellow at the Shorenstein Center. Our guest today, as we open our 12th season in this series, is Dan Rather. For 24 years, the anchor of the CBS Evening News, now a reporter for 60 Minutes. This season, we are focusing, when possible, on two deceptively simple questions. What is journalism, and who is a journalist? Our conversation with Dan Rather is being carried live by C-SPAN on XM satellite radio, on WMAL radio here in Washington, and it is being taped for later use by PBS Channel 32 and a few other stations as well. I'm also happy to report that we're being supported by a grant from the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation and by Bloomberg News. A very short biographical bit as we begin. Dan Rather was born and educated in Texas. He wanted to be a journalist and he became one of the very best in the business. He joined CBS News in 1962. He has covered just about every major story since then. Every campaign and convention, every war, including the ongoing one in Iraq, every global upheaval, natural or political. His style has always been distinctive. Unlike most other reporters who do their jobs and go home, Rather has often managed to get into scraps with presidents of all people, including Nixon, Bush I, and Bush II. We all remember the controversial National Guard story of last fall. So, Dan, let's get started. Thank you very much, by the way, for returning to the Kalb Report. The last time you were here was shortly after 9/11, and I remember the very deeply personal and emotional way that you were responding to those tragic days.
Well, thank you, Marvin, and I'm honored to be here tonight. I'd be remiss if I did not point out that there are at least two great reporters in this audience besides yourself. Your brother Bernard Kalb, former CBS News, New York Times correspondent, Peter Mayer, who is the White House correspondent for CBS News, and I'm honored that they're here.
Excellent. Dan, you've been a journalist for almost 50 years, and back then, like 50 years ago, I would not even have dreamed of asking you this question because we would both have known the answer. But I am starting with the simple question, what, in your opinion, is journalism these days?
Well, you know, it's an excellent question, and one particularly, I think, to the point these days, because if I'm in a judge, and I'm frequently not, I think the definition is changing even as we speak. But what is journalism? A shot from horseback definition would be the practice of journalism is the gathering of who, what, when, where, how, and why of events, and attempting to be an honest broker of what happened, not always as an eyewitness, but as a broad definition, an honest broker of information, trying to be as accurate and as fair as is humanly possible, while always recognizing that no one can be accurate and fair every second of every story in every year.
Does it make any difference, do you think, if we're described as being members of the media or of being members of the broader category or the more narrow category of journalism?
Well, I have a personal prejudice against the word media, and I recognize that I am tacking against a very strong wind. But there was a time, as with the start of a war, no one can pinpoint exactly when it was, but before sometime in the 1960s, no later than the very early 1970s, there was a concerted effort, not by no means all of it, but by some of it, by people with partisan, political, and or ideological persuasion, some of it by academics who did not fit in that, and some of it is the public at large, saying the word press included electronic journalism as well as print journalism, right, up until some point in the 1960s. And a lot of influences came together, not the least of which was the public at large saying, well, you keep saying the press, but you know, press indicates a printing press. But my problem with the word media is that the Bill of Rights in our Constitution of the United States speaks about freedom of the press. It doesn't speak about freedom of media. And
They might not have known the word then.
I don't think they did know the word then. Well, maybe those who studied ancient Greek, including Jefferson, might have known it. But here's the point, that I'm a little reluctant to say media. It still doesn't roll off my tongue very clearly for reasons mentioned. But, you know, that's probably just an idiosyncrasy of mine. But the whole idea of press freedom is so, it's the red beating heart of the practice of journalism in any society, free and independent society, any society attempting to be free and independent. So this is just one little finger in the wind saying, I prefer to use press as rather than the word media. But I fear we digress, because the core of your question.
Well, the idea is, and maybe I can help you here a little bit. I remember the time when we all shifted from being journalists or being called journalists to being called members of the media, was when Vice President Spiro Agnew, in the early part, I believe, of November of 1969, delivered 3 speeches attacking the media and meaning you and me and a lot of other people who worked essentially in television news. And he was trying to say that those people up in New York, they're not truly American. They're kind of different. They're a strange group. They live among themselves, probably read books. No, I'm just kidding. But he was at that time beginning the politically charged criticism of television news.
Well, going deep back into even classical history, no politician has ever been completely pleased with his press coverage. It just doesn't exist. However, what you just outlined, at least in a narrow, limited way, at least in that way, is true, that was a takeoff point, if you will. And the political scientists at George Washington and elsewhere could do a better job than I can. There were a number of purposes for that. Not the least of which was, number one, to isolate the press, to convince people that the press and members of the press that they were something apart, that they were elite. I always smile at the elite charge. Listen, I've made every mistake in the book at least 3 or 4 times. I have my marks and scars, and yes, some still open wounds. But elitist, and I mean this in no self-serving way. You know, I'm the son of a man who worked with his back and his hands all his life, and a mother who helped fill in when she could, making money as a waitress. I never saw the inside of anything but a public school the entire time. I never saw any place outside of Texas till I was 18 years old when I hitchhiked to New York. I basically didn't see it until I went into service briefly, and not with any distinction, a little later. And I'm a graduate of the only school of higher education that I'm graduate of, is Sam Houston State Teachers College. I'm very proud of it. It's now Sam Houston University. But the point is here, this is not the profile of an elitist. And I can smile when someone says that, and when former Vice President Agnew, Pat Buchanan, I think, wrote most of those speeches, if not all of them, probably some help with Bill Sapphire. I know it strikes you as funny, but that's actually true. Pat Buchanan was, as Dr. Henry Kissinger once said in another context, that has the added advantage of being true, that Pat Buchanan was writing speeches. But, you know, it was a takeoff point. But let's say that we had gone through the 60s. Spiro Agnew was then candidate Richard Nixon's surprise choice to be his vice presidential running mate in 1968. We'd gone through the 60s, and there were a lot of other forces and undercurrents that were at play, or at work, if you will. You know, I grew up in newsrooms, including the Huntsville Item and hanging around the Houston Chronicle, where everybody called himself a reporter. A journalist was a reporter with a cane. That is somebody who had, kind of gotten older. And even the word journalist, I don't think, slipped into the press usage until sometime after World War II. And schools of journalism, and the word journalism didn't come into widespread usage until after World War II. So all this is probably too much detail, but the time we got to the 60s and the country was torn in a lot of different directions, not only because of the Vietnam War, although it was a major catalyst for it. The country was changing. And politicians of all persuasions, not just Republicans, not just the Nixon-Agnew ticket and the Nixon-Agnew administration, were groping for ways, trying for ways to turn that to their advantage. And the Agnew speeches, which were directed at television, they had another purpose. These were wedge speeches. There's a lot of talk now in political campaigns about wedge issues. These were wedge speeches. They were designed to drive a wedge between the population at large, or as much of it as they could, and journalists, to isolate journalists, to wedge in that way. Designed to wedge electronic journalists, radio and television journalists, away from newspaper reporters. And the politicians considered that a fairly fertile field because newspaper owners, publishers, and yes, reporters down the ranks were beginning to get very nervous about television had finally established itself as a credible, legitimate source of information. So all of these things came together. But it wasn't just the Agnew speeches, but they brought attention to it, brought it to point. And you're right with the time period. I'd say the period between 1969 and the beginning of the presidential campaign in 1972, from the point of reference that you have given, was a key time.
And you know, you'll find this interesting, but not too long ago, right here at the National Press Club, an outfit called the Public Relations Society of America, Public Relations Society of America hosted a round table, and they called it, "Who is a Journalist Now?" It's interesting to me that PR people would have that in their minds as a theme, because people wonder who is a journalist now. And I'm going to ask you a list of some of these things so that we can all understand the issue better. One of your TV buddies is Larry King at CNN, right?
Yes.
He a journalist?
Says he isn't. I take him at his word. He doesn't claim to be a journalist.
But he keeps on saying that news is made on my program. So
yes, news is made on his program by the people he interviews. But he doesn't consider himself a journalist. He doesn't want to be considered a journalist.
He thinks of himself as a what?
As a master of the talk show format.
Okay. Is he then a member of the media?
He's definitely a member of the media.
Okay. So that
I would prefer the word press, but yes.
Right, but he'd be a member of the media and accepted by everybody as a member of the media.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm a little less certain about that, but I'm
would a blogger, somebody who works the internet and has his own site, a blogger, is that a member of the journal? Is he a journalist? She a journalist? Is the blogosphere part of the world of journalism, or is it part of the world of the media?
Well, you know, President Eisenhower once said, under certain circumstances, never miss an opportunity to keep your mouth shut. And because I'm not sure about this, I probably should take that counsel. But also because I want to be responsive to your question, I don't know. That's why I mentioned earlier, I think the definition of what is journalism, what is not media, but what is journalism, what is a journalist, we may be in a transition period where the definitions of journalism and a journalist are changing. And as so often the case when you're in the midst of a transition, it's a little hard to say. But I want to be as responsive to the question as possible. That some blogging, I think we could be guilty of overgeneralizing. Some blogging strikes me as at least a possible new form of journalism. Now, in my own mind, and I'm not trying to get anybody else to do this, if the blogger is prepared to put his or her name on it and be accountable for what they put on the blog, then in a stretch, and it would be a stretch for me, but keep in mind I'm 73, soon to be 74 years old and yesterday's man, in a stretch, I could see a person who wants to give information, wants to be an honest broker of information about the who, what, when, where, why of events, and has attached a name to it. That might be a new form of journalism. I'm not there yet, but it could be. Now, for someone who refuses to attach their name to it and wants to take what used to be called in journalism a no-risk shot by not having the name on it, that may be something new and important, but it's not journalism.
What about Rush Limbaugh?
You know, I've spoken to Rush Limbaugh. I remember being somewhere at lunch with him. I remember he gave me a very good cigar. I don't know whether Rush Limbaugh considers himself a journalist. I'd be surprised.
No, but what do you consider him?
No.
No.
I think he's...
but he's got a talk show, right?
He's another master of the talk show format. Whether you
Okay.
like him or dislike him, he's
So
very
he's
good
part
at
of
what
the
he
media
does.
then?
He's part of the media.
Okay, now what I'm getting at in my slow fumbling way is what is essentially the difference then in the current parlance between somebody who's a member of the media and somebody who still fashions himself, herself as a member of the journalistic caste? In other words, is there anything that is possibly dangerous, anything unusual, anything that you ought to be alert to if you begin to spread journalism out so that it fits into the broader category of media and God knows what, then the blogosphere?
Well, that's an interesting question, and you raise an interesting point that, for example, advertising people I consider to be part of the media.
Yes, they are.
Public relations people
PR
may not consider themselves as part of the media, but I would. They don't claim to be journalists, and I don't consider them to be journalists. So media is an overarching definition. I wouldn't say all-encompassing, but encompassing a lot of different disciplines and professions and crafts within it. Journalism, I get back to the offhand definition I gave you before of what a journalist is and what journalism is. If you seek to explain, cast new light on, give eyewitness and or earwitness testimony to who, what, when, where, why of events, then that's journalism. And that's the practice of journalism, and those who do it are journalists. And I would add to it, if one sees oneself, and insofar as it's humanly possible to do so, tries to be an honest broker of information. It may be filled with their own opinions, but an honest broker of information. Come down to the core of the practice of journalism has to be integrity. And integrity starts with some accountability. And again, if you just want a fast way to do it, I'd go back to if the person is a blogger and wants to be called a journalist, I'd say, well, let's start first of all, is your name, address on it? Do people know how to reach it? Are you accountable for what you do? I would eliminate anybody who doesn't do that.
Supposing the person has never been in this world before and is just furious with you, just absolutely furious with you.
A lot of those around.
There have been such people, right. And this person starts a website, puts his name there, and spends most of his time simply attacking you. Journalist?
If this person is attempting to be factually correct, yes. If it's strictly attacks with no effort to base it in fact in any way, shape, or form, then I don't think so.
Who are the people who are held in low repute today? Members of the media or journalists?
I'd say probably both. Did you say who's most in?
No, what I'm getting at is, in your mind, is there a difference then between a journalist and a member of the media in terms of the generally low repute in which this business is now being held?
Well, number one, I don't necessarily agree with the premise of your question, that journalists are held in low repute. You and I have had this discussion
Yes,
over
we
the years.
have.
You never met anybody who believed less in public opinion polls than I do. But having registered my suspicion about the premise of your question, let me accept it for purposes of giving an answer. I think the media, in the public's mind, as best I can judge, is such a broad, as I said before, if not all-encompassing, widely encompassing thing, that the public makes a difference. They see journalists and journalism as part of the media, but not the only part of the media. Now, I'm certain there's any number of people in the audience say, what is this man talking about? When I think of the media, I think of newspapers, radio, television, and maybe magazines. Acknowledging that some people feel that way, but I think a large portion of the public, who can say the majority, not I think it is, they know the difference between the media, the broad encompassing thing, and journalism and journalists. I do think that there is at least a tendency these days to say, well, gosh, I'm not sure anymore who a journalist is and whom I should recognize as a practicing journalist or not. I think there's some confusion in the public's mind about that.
Dan, you've always been an incredibly decent guy, and I think it's coming through again right now. I mean, you have a very generous view of what it is that is the public view of journalism now and the media, because just about every poll in which you don't believe rank journalists down there with root canal specialists as the kind of people they don't want to have anything to do with. And there has to be a reason for this, because it's different. Excuse me, it's different now from what it was when you and I first started in this business. It is definitely different. People react to journalists in a different way. I mean, for example, let me jump ahead. We're discussing differences between, in a way, old media and new media, and we're very much old media.
You are, Marvin, of course. I'm right out there on the cutting edge of new media, as you well know.
I mean, every now and then it even looks as if the new media is at war with the old media. I want to go back to the National Guard story of last year. It was the blogger, the internet blogger, who instantly went after you and CBS with an effect that was very damaging all the way around and played an impact indeed on the presidential campaign. I've always been astonished that even before the program ended, it was still on. A blog site called freerepublic.com, run by an active Air Force officer, blasted the program. 4 hours later, another website called Buckhead ran a detailed critique of the documents that you used in the report. And I've always wondered to myself, that's an amazingly swift bit of research. You watch something on air, 4 hours later, you are prepared to run pages and pages of detailed criticism of the documents. How does somebody do that quickly? Now, the LA Times identified Buckhead as a Republican lawyer in Atlanta named Harry McDougald. I don't know if that's true, but that's what the LA Times says. What happened then was that dozens of other bloggers joined in.
Sorry?
Then the mainstream media joined in. And then everything shifted, and the focus was on you. The focus was not on the substance of your story. The National Guard aspect of the whole thing sort of dropped to the side, and this media focus was on you.
Well, I don't find that unusual, that the media focus should come down to the on-air reporter. But there's so much in that question, Marvin, and I don't want to bog us down here, but I want to be directly responsive to it. But before I go to that, let me return to something before I forget it and before the trail goes cold. On your saying, well, why is it that every poll shows that reporters are not held in the kind of esteem that we once were? I think by and large that we are responsible for that, and I do not exclude myself from that criticism. There are a lot of other factors going into it, Spiro Agnew's speeches, politicians, and all of that thing. But I'm a great believer in the 10 magic words, which are, if it is to be, it is up to me. And that you have to have personal responsibility, and then besides that, you have to have professional and craft responsibility. The public, when journalism is at or near its best, when journalism is doing what American journalism has made its reputation doing, when we are true to ourselves, the public responds, and they respond in a positive way. You need look no further than what happened with Katrina the hurricane.
9/11.
Reporters got there. 9/11 was another case, but with Katrina, reporters got there.
Absolutely.
They took you there. That's what television does best. Television has a lot of weaknesses, but its great strength is it takes you there. Right. It took you to New Orleans. You could see, and they said, look around. And they pointed out as the late Eric Severide said, in one way or another said, we can only show you what's at the end of the flashlight beam. You point the camera, but keep an eye, this is happening. They took you there. There was no denying what was happening. And then, most important, what we so frequently don't do, and again, I don't exclude myself, they then spoke truth to power, which is, folks, we've shown you what's going on here. Now, can you believe that this politician, Republican, Democrat, mugwump, independent, whatever, is coming down here doing the old political game of trying to convince you that what your eyes see, what your ears hear, what you see for yourself, you aren't actually seeing and hearing it. And the public response to the reporters, and I think they did a great job. I think it was one of the great moments in television history of what happened with Katrina. So the point is, when reporters do what is in the best traditions of American journalism, the public responds positively. When the public gets a whiff of anything from, hey, these guys are beginning to think that they walk on water, and or, even worse, I think they get in the pocket of the politicians. They're scared, they're intimidated, they're afraid their access is going to get cut off, or they just don't have the spine that they once had. Then we should not be surprised. Then say nothing of when in our newspaper, and it happens in almost every newspaper in America, or on our newscast, we say, you know what, we're going to dumb it down, we're going to tart it up, we're going to sleaze it up, because for one thing, if we don't do it, our competitors will do it, and that's the way the wind is blowing. The public, I think, gets that. They know what's happening. In our arrogance, we sometimes think, we're fooling them. Or our bosses say, we've run polls, we run market research, and people want to hear, they don't want to hear about poverty in Africa. They don't want to hear about AIDS in China. They want to hear about Michael Jackson or whatever the latest murder case is in California, and they will bring data to prove it. When we succumb to that, when we don't speak truth to our own power, journalism power, and say, you know what, I didn't get into business to do that. When we are true to that, that's when the public begins to say, you know what, I don't think much of these guys anymore. Now, who's the best known electronic journalist of all time? The founding saint of electronic journalism, Edward R. Murrow. People always want to say, well, why in the world are they always talking about Murrow? Because Murrow, amazingly, the person who invented electronic journalism as we know it, understood something, I think it was a combination of experience and instinct in him, said, the public they'll pick out something phony so quick. And mind you, he made most of his reputation in radio, had a great career in television. But that's where I think we lose, and we have primarily ourselves to blame. Every time we cower, every time we say, I know the tough question to ask, but you know what? I'm just going to sit here on my duff. I'm not getting up, and I'm not going to face the bloggers. I'm not going to face the political machine that's going to come down on me. Every time we do that, we lose, and we ought to lose. Now, sorry that took so long.
No, but before you go to the answer to the other one, let me just say I want to associate myself with everything that you have just said. I agree with you completely. I wish that other people with your reputation and stature stood up and said that every day in front of Macy's in New York so that people will understand that journalists have that kind of responsibility and that the people will understand when they're doing a good job. And there's no, thank you. There's absolutely no doubt that journalism was brilliant at the time of 9/11. You were right there in the middle of it. It was brilliant. It really told the American people what was going on. There was no lying, there was no nonsense. And that was certainly true with Katrina. But in between, Dan, there was the Iraq War. And in that period of time, many, many people in this country, I don't know about majorities or whatever, I don't go around counting, but many people in this country believed that the journalists sort of held back. They were still so caught up with the patriotism of 9/11 that they allowed the patriotism to dominate their professional instincts.
Well, let me respond to that, Martin.
Please.
Marvin, that I think it was T.S. Eliot said, between the thought and the act falls a shadow. And that's what happens with journalists, including this one, time and time again, and with increasing frequency. That's something that the consumers of news need to think about, increasing frequency. You frequently know the right thing to do. You know it isn't right to what I call sleaze it up, dumb it down, tart it up, go for so-called soft news when so much is happening. You know it isn't right, but there's always that survival thing and sort of, well, I asked a tough question 3 months ago. I'm not getting up and running that risk again. Let somebody else take the heat this time. All of those things, we're human, they come into play. What happened, and you raise a very good point, that the public has a sense that we didn't do nearly as much as what we should have done, which is, in my opinion, practice tough, skeptical journalism. Never cynical. There's a difference between being skeptical and being cynical. I have nothing for cynicism in journalism. But tough, skeptical journalism, by and large, it didn't get done. It didn't get done by me. It didn't get done by CBS, and I don't speak for them. It just didn't get done. Now, however, I don't think, and I say this gently, this is where the Texan in me may come out, that when it comes to patriotism, nobody questions my patriotism sitting down. You got to get up. But what's happened with patriotism, and I have been accused, and rightly so, of, in the run-up to the war, being, quote, too patriotic. I think that's an oxymoron. I don't think you can be patriotic. But here's what we've lost sight of, and again, I said it for at least the fourth time, I don't excuse myself. There's a temptation, more with some people than others, more at some times than others, to believe that to be a patriotic journalist is you go along. The bands play, the flags wave, the thunderous speakers speak, and you say, this is where we go. But the patriotic journalist, the true patriot, who's a journalist, says, my job, where I fit into this, my wee, small, infinitesimal, almost microscopic contribution, if any, is to do my job as a journalist. And that is to ask the tough questions, keep on asking the tough questions, have the skepticism, don't fall into the trap of getting scared. And that's the definition of a patriotic journalist. So when you say, well, we all got into patriotism, I would argue we weren't patriotic enough by the definition I was given.
Exactly.
By this definition.
Okay, Dan, let's go to what happened and what it is that I was describing about the National Guard story. I mean, you've obviously had a lot of time to think about this, and you've been asked about it 100 times. But what have you learned about it? I mean, as you look back upon it, what is it that Dan Rather, the outstanding journalist, what has he learned from that whole experience?
Well, I appreciate the compliment, Marvin, and I'm still learning from it. First, about the bloggers. One thing I learned, I knew it going in, but sometimes you have to keep learning. I'm fond of saying, because it's true, I don't always learn fast, but I learn good. And one of the things that I learned about this is not to overgeneralize about bloggers. And going down the list of what things that happened to us. And yes, there are some strange and, to me, still mysterious things, certainly unexplained things that happened about how it got attacked and why, even before the program was over. But I try not to bog down in it. What I learned is that there are bloggers who have as much integrity as I or the most integrity-filled people I know have, and who feel that it's their mission in life to ask questions and keep on asking questions. There are other bloggers, and I'll go ahead and say it, that some of the, quote, mainstream press seem to take, if not delight in our dilemma, they picked up pretty quickly on those bloggers who were partisan, politically affiliated, and or had an ideological axe to grind with us. And instead of saying, well, they've raised these questions, for example, about the documents, are these questions true? Next thing I know, they were in mainstream newspapers, and away it went. But it's very important, Marvin, to understand that we had a responsibility when we did that story. We met that responsibility to the best of our ability at the time. We did not do it perfectly. We did not do it perfectly. And when I say we underestimated the potential of the attacks that were going to come on us, some of them from the right motivation, some of them from what I've described before. But here's the thing about blogging. You don't want to overgeneralize. There are a lot of different kinds of bloggers. But we, and I include myself in this, we dealt with a story that had thermonuclear potential for reaction. And instead of saying, we have to be prepared to respond quickly to any and all criticism, we were remarkably unprepared for that. I think it's fair to say, and again, I just speak for myself, but I believe it to be true of CBS News, and I think it was true of a lot of news organizations, unaware or not knowing enough of how quickly bloggers could strike. And when strike is kind of an emotionally loaded word, I guess, but both those who didn't wish us well and may have been organized for their own partisan political purposes, but others who were saying, hey, I don't believe this. You just don't want to overgeneralize, but we were not prepared to meet the thing. Now, an independent panel that was appointed, right, headed by a longtime Republican, a man who's Mr. Thornburg, who was former Attorney General of the United States and is a distinguished American, but a good friend of the Bush family, headed this independent panel. And the independent panel concluded, what did they conclude? One, that what we did, whatever anybody thought about it, was not born of political bias. Number two, that with 3 to 4 months and many millions of dollars to spend on trying to determine, they could not and did not determine whether the documents in question were what they purported to be or not. And the third thing that was said by the panel was that the main reason that a panel had to be appointed and what they were most critical about is how we defended the story after the story had run. And I'm paraphrasing here, but I think it's an accurate paraphrase. I want it to be said in my own case that my principal, I didn't say crime, my principal problem was that I stuck by the story, I stuck by our people for too long. I'm guilty of that. I believed in the story. The facts of the story were correct. One supporting pillar of the story, albeit an important one, but one supporting pillar was brought into question. To this day, no one has proven whether it was what it purported to be or not. But in terms of my own side, it was he stuck by the story. I stuck by the story because I believed in it. He stuck with his people. Listen, I've made nearly every mistake in the book, but my attitude when we go into stories, we go into them together, we ride through whatever happens, and we come out the other end together. And I didn't give up on my people, our people. I didn't, and I won't.
Dan, thank you. You said, I believe you just said, that you think the story is accurate.
Well, the story is accurate.
Okay. What I was saying before was that the thrust of the criticism ended up, perhaps deliberately, being aimed at you rather than the substance of the story itself. So that people at that time, the public, just enjoyed the feast, it seemed, of just going after rather, but they were not dealing with the heart of what it is that you said.
Well, two things about that, Mark. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I want to ask this question. You have an opportunity now. You're a reporter for 60 Minutes. That's a very important program. Would you go now and go back to that story and do it again and find the documentation that would in fact prove what you believe to be the accuracy of that story?
Straight up, no chaser, no. One, CBS News doesn't want me to do that story.
Why?
They wouldn't let me do that story. Well, that's a question you'd have to ask them. But I've moved on from it. And I've done my best to put it behind me. I've taken, taken my licks, taken my shots. But I do want to say to Marvin about my experience with the public. And it's true, I've been a reporter for just over 50 years. And I've been in radio and television for just about 50 years. In fact, I think 50 years this year.
You look like a young man to me, rather.
Yeah, you tell that to all the girls, I know. But I have always been humbled, and I recognize that's not a word generally associated with anchor people and the egocentric world of television news, but I've always been humbled by how much the audience gets it. That is, if you do something wrong, if you try to fool them, they pick up on it right away. And never more than what this last year has said to me, that the public at large did not, as you put it, feast on us. The public at large, they got it. They knew exactly what happened. Nobody had to spend much time explaining it to them. We had a story you can argue that we shouldn't have, might have, could have, should have, shouldn't have handled it during a political campaign, but they understood that what we reported at the central facts of the story, and there were new insights into the president's, were correct. And to this day, by the way, have not been denied, which is always the test of whether the facts are. They understood that on the documents, as I said once, I wish we had done it better. No excuses, not a matter of we didn't have enough time, we were crashing into things. No excuses. They get it. And that gives me a lot of hope. I don't want this to sound some sophomoric journalism thing, but I really believe it inside, that something's turning in the country when it comes to journalism. I think that people have begun to understand that there are pressures on journalists. Again, I'm not complaining about it. It goes with the territory. Is you have to be able to face the furnace and take the heat if you're any good at all. But the public's now beginning to understand that because a number of things have happened. This whole business of get the picture, we have a reporter who didn't print a story in jail when somebody, somewhere, fairly high up, had exposed an undercover intelligence agent is still running around. Now, however that turns out, and wherever you stand, the public has a sense, there's a lot goes on underneath when it comes to pressuring reporters, and a lot of games are played in there. And when a reporter handles a difficult story, when a reporter faces the furnace and says, okay, I'll take the heat, the public understands it. Now, if you're wrong, they're going to nail you. You won't have to wait for the politicians or the political operatives to do it. The public will nail you, and they'll nail you solid. But if you're out there every day trying to do a good job, and you make a mistake, or it's a little unclear whether you made a mistake or not, they get it. I have more confidence in the audience today than I've ever had. And part of it is because I think something is beginning to turn. People understand that many of the politicians in both parties and of all persuasions have gotten so good at what I call hidden hand pressure. The public is waking up to it. And if we're to have an increase in integrity-filled journalism, it will start with the public demanding it.
Can you distinguish, Dan? I want to go into so many questions here, but it's fascinating. Would you be able to distinguish blogger from public from blogger?
Well, the world of blogging is part of the public. Good, bad, indifferent, and hard to tell. It's certainly part of the public.
No, but when you talk about the public, you want to have, almost the way you said it, I had the feeling, looking at your eyes and looking at the manner in which you speak, I had the feeling that you were thinking of the mass of the American people.
In that context, that's what I was talking about.
That's what you were talking about.
But I include bloggers in that. Again, let's don't overgeneralize.
Okay.
All bloggers, no.
Oh, okay.
But some bloggers, yes.
Dan, you've often used the word courage in your broadcasts, right?
Yes.
Why?
I think not often, but I have.
No, but
I went through a very short period where I wanted to close the broadcast.
But why? Why that word? What does it say to you? Why do you want to use that?
Well, first of all, it was my father's favorite word. My mother's favorite word was meadow. Somewhere back in, the catacombs of my mind as a child, I know, God rest her soul, my mother's favorite word was meadow. She just liked the ring of the word. She liked what it conjured up in her mind and what she hoped it would conjure up in ours. And my father's favorite word was courage. Again, I think he liked the strength of the word. I think he liked the definition of the word. And so it begins with that.
Okay.
That's part of it. The other is that I came to like the word a lot.
Good.
Sometimes saying it gives me my best chance to mount maybe just a wee small part of it. But it was no big deal, and I became convinced that it was not a good idea to end the broadcast with it when I made an effort to do so for one time. But for you and you alone today and today only, I'll reveal something to you. There's part of me that says, damn, I wish I hadn't caved. I wish I'd stuck with it.
Do you think that your network showed courage last fall? Okay.
No, I don't want that silence to indicate an answer. I think that's something each person has to judge for themselves. I was then, I have been ever since then, and I am now really proud to work at CBS News. I've been mightily blessed and really lucky.
Okay.
I like the people, and yes, I think there are all kinds of courageous people inside CBS News.
Okay. I don't want to push that. There's a phrase that is often used these days, was in the paper again today, the end of an era. The idea being that you're no longer doing the evening news at CBS. Brokaws retired from NBC, and the death of Peter Jennings has left a huge hole at ABC. I think except for NBC, where Brian Williams seems to have slipped into Brokaw's seat almost seamlessly, there are two large openings at CBS and at ABC. What kind of a person, given what you have said about the changing mood of the people, but the changes within the industry itself, what kind of a person ought now to be an anchorman?
Someone who loves the news. But the first requirement is to love the news. And if they choose a person or persons who love the news, then they're going to be all right, we're going to be all right, and the audience will be all right. Marvin, if I may say so, this business of end of an era, I know you have another question to get to him.
No, go ahead.
Makes me a little uneasy.
Why?
Well, because we're reporters. And era, the connotation of an era is something big and important. Listen, three guys who read the news is not all that important. Now, in whatever we did...
30 million people watch the three guys who read the news.
Well, but, 50 million watch nymphomaniac housewives on Sunday night. So that doesn't really tell you anything. The way I want to be judged, the way I hope to be judged, anybody offhanded might take an interest, is when you went out to cover the news, when you went to Tiananmen Square, name a story, when you put it on the line with the Civil Rights Movement, or either one of the wars. When you go, something that we pioneered at CBS News, when one became the mobile anchor, which the technology beginning roughly in the 80s allowed us to do, then that's something different from anchoring. So end of an era, I don't know, eras are reserved for important historical periods and or really important historical people, not for workaday journalists. I can be dumb as this.
Dan, you are marvelous, but you are no ordinary workaday journalist.
Well, listen, I hate mediocrity.
If I had an ordinary workaday journalist, there would not be 600 people sitting out here now looking.
No, but I take your point. But okay. I can be dumb as this table about some things, but I'm at least smart enough to know this. I'm a reporter who got lucky, very lucky. Now, there are a lot of reporters, there are a hell of a lot of reporters who are a better reporter than I'll ever be. And some of them are in this new generation, if you want to use the era, coming on this new era. I can't tell you how impressed I was again at the Katrina thing. But the toughest thing when you're on television, particularly when you're on television daily, is this business of you constantly inhaling a kind of NASA-grade rocket fuel for the ego. And you begin to think it's about you. It ain't about you. It's always about the news. And what concerns me when people talk about, well, we need new graphics or we need a whole new way of doing the news, which I think is okay. I believe in innovation. But it's the news that matters. It's not the presenter or the package or the way it's presented. And, you know, it's very hard when you get what I call up above the tree line in journalism, up where the air is thin, up where you think the Dalai Lamas of journalism run. It's very hard to keep it in perspective, but it's very important to do so. It's not about us, it's not about me, it's not about some three-anchor era. It's about the news.
Philosophically, I'm with you all the way. Dan, in a recent speech, you described a new journalism order, and you spoke of dumbed-down, tarted-up coverage. You spoke of 24/7 cable news. You spoke about the competition, the chase for ratings, and you concluded, among other things, and I'm quoting you, all of this creates a bigger atmosphere of fear in newsrooms.
Yes.
I've heard you talk about fear before. Fear from what? What is the fear?
Well, part of it is fear of failure, which everybody has in one degree or another, whatever craft or profession they're in. Listen, the salesman out there every day trying to sell insurance has fear he won't meet his quota. You know, everybody has fear of some kind. But I do think, and I think you're referring to a forum or symposium at Fordham University.
At Fordham
recently.
last Monday.
And I've said it before, partly to remind myself that on my better days I'd like not to succumb to it. But having said that, I have succumbed to it. We all do. That I think it's important for the public to understand that, in my opinion, just one guy's opinion, and certainly people in journalism would disagree, that in one way or another, fear runs rampant in every newsroom in the country now. And you say, well, fear of what? Okay. What I tried to explain, I'll try to keep it a little shorter this time, is beginning in the 1980s, and by the way, there's a lot of good journalism practice on cable, so I didn't pick on cable. I said, what changed in the 80s is the size of the competitive pit began to grow and has now grown much, much larger. Before, say, 1980, 1981, in terms of television, you had 3 major over-the-airways networks and maybe 3 or 4 newspapers. The internet didn't exist. But as the competitive pit got larger, the competition got fiercer. And as the competition got fiercer, the fear of failure began to grow. And the fear of, I don't really want to cover this story, or I don't want to give this story 3 minutes on the evening news, but if we don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. So there's that fear. There's a fear of, look, our ratings are sinking. And I know what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan is really important. But look at the ratings. Every time, it doesn't happen, but somebody will bring them in and say, listen, every time, it used to be if it bleeds, it leads. It used to be sort of a saying about local news. Well, now, a corollary to that is, if you lead foreign, you die, which is, in journalistic terms, if you put international news up at the top, rather than the latest killing in California or wherever, or Michael Jackson or what have you, you die. So you're talking about fear. As this competitive pit grew, and it's now much larger, the competition got fiercer. And, you didn't quite know where things come from. Bloggers, where'd they come from? Whoop, up against the side of the head. Down below. So this kind of fear, there's also the fear, and let's have it out for what it is. There's also the fear if you question power.
That's what I was getting at. Are you talking about fear of government?
There is some fear of government. It isn't just the fear of government. And again,
No, I understand the context, but that's part of it too.
Absolutely. And what it's led to is a belief, you know what? Things have changed since the day of Edward R. Murrow, or name your favorite journalist of real guts and courage, real spine. And particularly young people are susceptible to believing, listen, if I want the mayor to like me, It's a version of what F. Scott Fitzgerald called the American disease, wanting everybody to like you. If you want everybody to like you, you aren't going to practice a very high-quality journalism. You may become a very well-known anchor person. You may become a television star. You may become a celebrity, but you're not going to be much of a journalist if you go around wanting everybody to love you. So there is this tendency, whether it's covering the White House, Congress, the mayor, the county judge, the state legislature, to say, I want them to love me, and if they love me, I'll be in good shape with the boss, I'll get in good shape with the public. So I do think that there's a climate of fear. I don't want to overstate it, but I also think it's very important for the public to understand in context that it's there.
Thank you, Dan, very much. I have a number of questions which I would appreciate, just a quick response. As you look toward the future, do you see yourself at any point in the immediate future leaving broadcast news?
I don't foresee it. It could happen as long as I have my health, and with God's grace, I'll be reporting somewhere. I have a passion for reporting, and I can't see myself ever not reporting as long as I have my health. In broadcasting, I love broadcasting. I love CBS News. I'm pouring myself into 60 Minutes, but my mother used to have a saying about yesterday, no tears, about tomorrow, no fears. So, who can say what's ahead? But the short answer is no, I don't see myself getting out of broadcasting.
You don't see yourself joining one of the 24/7 cable operations like CNN?
I don't see it, but I have respect for a lot of people in cable news, and that, as I said before, renewed respect after the job that most of them did during this hurricane. I don't foresee it, but I don't rule it out.
Do you see yourself starting a blog site?
I've thought about it, but not as long as I'm at CBS News. I don't see that.
There are many, many, many journalism students here, and we've only got a minute or so. What advice would you give to them, in addition to all of the sort of general guidance that you've already laid out? What advice would you give to them? Is it still the craft that you would recommend they enter?
If they burn with a hot, hard flame to do it, yes. But that's a requirement. First, you have to love the news. Second, you have to burn with a really hot, hard flame to do it. It has to stop short, but just short of being an obsession. It definitely has to be a passion if you're going to be any good at it. The other is learn to write. This is my story, this is my song, this is my creed all day long. If you want to be in journalism, learn to write. It's the bedrock of the craft. And with the allure of television and being a television personality and star, there are increasing numbers of people who think they can make it all the way, not being able to write. Well, they may become a television star, they may become a celebrity, but they aren't going to be much of a journalist if they don't learn to write and make a lifetime of becoming a better writer a goal. That's as much advice as I have, but I caution them that, like all free advice, is probably not worth very much.
I doubt that very much indeed. Dan, I probably could go on for another hour, but don't worry, I'm not going to do that. Our time's up, so I want to thank you first. I want to thank our wonderful audience.
Thank you.
One of the largest ever gathered here at the Press Club. All of you. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I want to thank the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation and Bloomberg News for helping us. I want to thank C-SPAN and XM Satellite Radio. I want to thank, as always, the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard, the National Press Club and the George Washington University, and more than anyone, I want to thank the incomparable Dan Rather for being our guest today.
Thanks, Bob. That's terrific. Absolutely. Wonderful to meet you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm Marvin Kalb. Good night and good luck.